May I have your attention, please? Thank you. I'm usually not anxious when it comes to public speaking, but I cannot hide how excited I am today because it's really a very rare opportunity. Dear Vice Rectors, dear Professor Dr. Muqtedar Khan, dear colleagues, professors, members of academic staff, dear members of administrative staff, it's my really huge pleasure and honor to be here today. It's one of the rare moments when I'm saying to myself a pinch to know that I'm not dreaming, because it's really a moment that I have been dreaming of since I have returned from my fellowship in the US. When I was there, while I was high in the skies and I took a picture, I wrote "Dream Big," but even then I was still not sure how dreams can be, how big dreams can be. And it was due to Dr. Khan, the academic director of the SUSI program for US foreign policy, also full professor at the University of Delaware, that I realized how dreams can be big and how wide the sky can be. I also had a very huge support by the university, and it's my very great pleasure to be here today with all of you and to announce the guest lecture that will be given by Professor Dr. Khan. But first I will give the floor to Professor Dr. Bilic so she can also welcome the audience. And thank you so much.
Dear Professor Dr. Khan, dear Vice Rector, Secretary General, academic staff at 5BU, and our dearest students. It is our pleasure today, and let's say maybe we are lucky that Professor Khan was in these days in Europe, and he was invited by our assistant Lea Ognianovska as a fellow from American Fellowship Program to invite him to be today and to visit the IBU and to be today with us.
So the US has many sources of soft power, US music, Hollywood, so on and so forth. And besides that, the key aspect of US hegemony is its legitimacy. And that legitimacy comes from two sources. One is democracy and the other is multilateralism. So the fact that the United States is a democracy and at least claims to be. Of course, when you look at the fine print, you will find that the US currently does not even rank as a full democracy on the democracy index. It's at number 30. It's a struggling democracy. But the fact that there's so much of rhetoric that even Joe Biden at the moment says that the world is divided into two groups. One is a democratic group and the other is authoritarian group. But if you actually look at the many countries do not really qualify as democracies. But nevertheless, as part of the talking points. But it's also about ideas. It's also about ideas. If you look at some of the biggest things that have happened to us in the past few years, I mean, planes, for example, air travel, nuclear weapons. Have you all watched Oppenheimer? I did. I need to see it again because I need to go back and reread the history of quantum physics and then watch it again because there's some very important scientists who are portrayed in Oppenheimer. But if you look at it, this is what the US was able to do in the 1940s. Huge, massive project. So the US brings a lot of ideas to the human condition, not just to world politics. The internet, you know, Al Gore invented internet. That's a joke in the US. Internet was something that created in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s by US Department of Defense, and then afterwards it was privatized and you have out there. So some of the biggest ideas out there that you see are also coming, except TikTok, I think everything else is coming from the US. Whether it's Facebook or Twitter. Elon Musk, we took him to America and now he's producer of such amazing technology, and so on and so forth. So these ideas, American investment in sciences, investment in multilateral institutions, etc., are also sources of the legitimacy that makes America a hegemon. So what kind of a global order has this hegemon created? So the United States is like an imperial power that does not rule by direct contacts. We don't conquer the world. We influence the world through multilateral institutions. So all the multilateral institutions that are part of global governance, whether it's the UN Security Council, the United Nations, World Bank, IMF, etc., you find that they are all heavily under US influence. It's only in the UN where the US influence has declined significantly in the General Assembly, but at least in the Security Council, the US, along with France and Britain, has a 3-2 advantage over East. So the West dominates the East 3-2 in the UN Security Council. So the US has built a world order based on multilateralism, which gives a lot of US activities legitimacy. But after 9/11, when the US could not get the whole world on its side, and so we started inventing new words like a coalition of the willing and so on and so forth. That was because the world was already beginning to resist the US-backed global order. When we talk of world orders, we talk of it basically on the basis of distribution of power. So for example, after 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you could argue that we were living in a world which was unipolar. The United States was a dominant power, unchallenged economically, politically, or in any other way. Some people say the unipolarity ended on 9/11 in 2001. Other people say, no, it ended with the economic crisis in 2008. Some people say, well, the 2 wars that are happening right now are basically trying to put an end to the unipolarity of the United States. And of course, you know what a bipolar system is during the Cold War when there are 2 competing powers, and then there's multipolarity. These days, you hear more and more countries talk about the world as a multipolar world. The moment you hear the word multipolar world, you must understand that it is code for a world not dominated by US. So when a country says, we are living in a multipolar world, they're saying, can we get rid of the US, please? You hear that a lot from India, you hear that from France. So these are people who are irritated by American domination. But if you were truly living in a multipolar world, then you wouldn't have seen the war that is going on in Gaza right now. It's genocidal. Okay. What, 13,000 civilians killed, 5,000 children killed with F-16s and rockets and missiles. Sponsored by the United States, funded by the United States, legitimized by the United States, legally defended by the United States. It's like saying that if you take my car, if you take my gun, if you take my credit card, then you drive, fill the car with gas using my credit card, and then you go and commit a massacre with my guns. And when people accuse you of a massacre, I send my lawyers to protect you. Then I have some culpability to what you have done. And you're witnessing that. But where are the so-called other powers? Where are the Russian submarines? Where are the Russian aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean? Where are the Chinese? Where are Indians? Where are the French? French, at least in the Security Council, they have taken positions which are contrary to the United States. And so have Russia and China. But other than pushing resolutions which they themselves know will be vetoed by the US, there are no concrete efforts made by any of these powers to restrain the United States. And that tells me that we are not living in a multipolar world. The US doesn't feel the need to consult with Russia or China or France or India before it makes whatever commitments it's making right now. So in that sense, you can see that you are still, when it comes to at least military capabilities and economic capabilities, you're still living in a unipolar moment. So that is an important aspect. And you could say that you're saying that because you're an American. No, I'm a very big critic of American foreign policy, but I see the world as it is. And right now, when I look at it, it doesn't look like a multipolar world. If it was a multipolar world, the US would have first consulted with other powers before giving all the green lights to Israel to whatever is happening. But the good news is that there's the temporary ceasefire and there's going to be exchange of hostages and things might look better. So what are the challenges to this multi-order? The first and fundamental challenge is the fact that the US has gone from 50% of the global economy to 25% of the global economy. That itself tells you that the gap between 1 and 2 has reduced. So if you look at during the Cold War, the US was still around 40% of the global economy, and the Soviet Union was never above 12%. So the gap was huge between the 1 and 2, but that's not the case anymore. The gap is very narrow. But if you make adjustment for purchasing power capacity, you will find that China's economy has already surpassed that of the US. So China, in terms of within its domestic context, can do more with money than the US can do. So the gap is reducing between 1 and 2. But there are other things that are happening in this world. The pandemic, for example, it is really testing the leadership of the United States. And unfortunately, we had Mr. Donald Trump at that time. So if you look at the Ebola crisis, the leadership role that Barack Obama played, and the complete absence of US leadership in the early days of the coronavirus crisis, it tells you that the United States was conceding the leadership role that it normally plays. The world was not looking to the US at that time. And that is a big danger. And that danger comes from a growing trend in the United States where more and more people are thinking in terms of America first. So if you look at not just Donald Trump, but if you listen to, say, Vivek Ramaswamy, who's running for president on the Republican side, this insistence that America first, as if other presidents were coming and saying, I'm running for the president of the United States and my agenda is Europe first, or Israel first, or Asia first. No one ever says that. The only thing they say is by strengthening Asia, we strengthen America. But now, America first means we will strengthen America and we don't care what happens to the rest of you. And that you saw in the absence of US leadership in the early days of the coronavirus crisis. So the climate change issue with Donald Trump withdrawing from the Paris Accords, etc., was a blow to the global efforts to fight the environment. And then, of course, we reversed that after Joe Biden became president. So you have climate change kind of issues, pandemic issues, which are global in nature. So when President Biden talks about the relationship with China, says, look, we compete geopolitically, but we should cooperate on the issue of climate change and pandemics, which are global in nature. And if the US and China do not cooperate, then we're not really going to be able to address these issues with as much effectiveness as we really need to do. So those are the two challenges which are, shall we say, global, planetary in nature. But then you have two other kinds of things. For a long time, we thought that interstate battles and interstate wars were over, and the dominant threat security was coming from non-state actors. So more and more states versus terrorist groups across the world, or dissident groups, whatever you want to call them. But now suddenly we are living in a world where you have both. You have interstate and intrastate. So for example, take the case of Pakistan fighting the Taliban. Across the border, over the border issues, there's a huge border dispute between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Not many people are noticing, but Pakistan is deporting hundreds of thousands of people. They've threatened to deport about 1.7 million Afghans. And they've already started the process. If the Israel war was not happening, the media would have focused on that as the number one humanitarian crisis that we are facing today. So you can see fighting Taliban across the border and fighting Taliban inside the border is an example of the kind of world we are living in. So that is one challenge. And then the challenge is also about technology. So for example, Iranian drones have played havoc with Ukraine. And Turkish drones helped Ukraine defend Kiev in the early part of the war. Turkish drones upset the balance between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So suddenly you have not so major powers leapfrogging on technology. That is a very interesting development. So you could take a small segment of technology and specialize it and suddenly catch up with world powers. If you have a smart group of 20 people in your university, who make some breakthroughs on AI, you will be a superpower. Not economically, not militarily, but you could have, you know, the whole series of Tom Cruise's latest Mission Impossible is about this threat of artificial intelligence bringing the world down to its knees because it can hack the world. So you could have a small bunch of people. So this threat of technology can also upset the global balance of power. And then there is another interesting thing that the US itself is responsible for undermining its own global order, is the abuse of the institutions that it developed. So for example, the use of SWIFT. I don't know if you know what SWIFT is, transactions between countries, exchange of money. The US weaponized all these institutions against Russia after Russia acquired. These are institutions created for global cooperation. So when we were marketing SWIFT, we said, this is good for everybody. Well, no. Now you suddenly disclose, no, it's not good for anybody. The US can use that as a weapon against you. And let me tell you, Russia, China, no one couldn't use that as a weapon against the US. So the institutions that the United States created to bring legitimacy to itself and the global order that it supports, it started weaponizing that and undermined the legitimacy of that very order. And by undermining the legitimacy of that order, the US is contributing to the collapse of that particular order. So this is an important point, that one of the challenges to the US order is the US itself. To give you one interesting example, the US has been working very hard to punish Russia for what it is doing in Ukraine. And so they are trying to create a special court which will prosecute the Russians for war crimes in Ukraine. And those special courts are going to have to be cleared by the United Nations. So the United Nations will have to vote, the General Assembly will have to vote, and suddenly now the the world realizes that every time that issue is going to come up, that court will also apply to Israel. So if you're going to punish people for bombing civilian targets, like hospitals, the Russians bombed a hospital yesterday. Why do you think they did it? Because now they feel they can do it because Israel does it. No international order courts are going to prosecute Russia, because if they prosecute Russia, they will have to prosecute Israel, and the US would rather destroy international institutions. US has withdrawn from international organizations to protect Israel. So this weaponization and double standards in the application of the global order is one reason why the order is not as strong as it ought to be. So the double standards that the US itself has implemented, abusing its own Security Council veto, and also some of the institutions that it has created, I think are contributing to its decline. So what's coming next? What's at the end of the tunnel? People keep saying that we are in the tunnel. Do we see a light? Do we see something else coming out of it? So this is a very dangerous situation in that sense, that if we see the decline of the United States, it doesn't mean that the order that is going to emerge is going to be good for everybody. We don't know what it is, but try imagine a world dominated by China and Russia. Would you like that? So one of the classes that I took in my PhD program was on American foreign policy. I made the life of the professor miserable for like the first year. Every time he tried to talk about the principal move of the US, I would give an example of hypocrisy. So he would say, the United States believes in rule of law. I said, really? And give an example. Well, what rule of law are you talking about? You're starving people in Gaza. This is genocide happening in front of your eyes. So, but those are older examples. So on the 4th or 5th week of the semester, the professor was totally frustrated with me. I thought he was going to throw me out of the class. He picked up a fat book. I thought, oh shit, he's going to hit me with it. So he said, take this. This is American power. Take it. Now give it to a country of your choice. That was a very interesting moment in my life. I was an international student. I was not an American citizen. Who would I give that power to? Russia? Certainly not. one of the good things coming out of this is that Russia's imperial ambitions are getting a wake-up call. They say without Ukraine, Russia is not an empire. It's a third world country with nuclear weapons. With Ukraine, it's an empire. That's Brzezinski. But so he gives me this and says, this is American power. Which country would you like to give it to? I didn't know what to do with it. I had just come from India, 4 months. I knew enough about India not to give it to India. So if I couldn't give it to my own country, who would I give the American power to? He said, take your time. The class has 2 more hours. At the end of the 2 hours, I want to know who you want to give the power to. Well, I had no answer. So I gave it back to America. Of course, later on, other professors told me, oh, you were so stupid. You should have dismantled American power and distributed it to other forms, international organizations. You should have given some to the UN. You should have given some to the UNESCO. I didn't think through that point. But that is a very serious question for all the countries who are delighting in the declining power of the United States to say that be careful what you're wishing for. What comes next? The US has been definitely quite arrogant in its domination of the world. The US is also quite demanding. The US also abandons allies. Look how we abandoned Afghanistan, we abandoned Laos. And I think we have abandoned Ukraine now. Nobody covers Ukraine anymore since this Israeli war has happened. But that doesn't mean that the alternatives out there are better. So one of my former countrymen, Amitava Acharya, talks about something called the multiplex order rather than a multipolar order, trying to say that, well, other countries can bring other ideas to the table. They can bring civilizations to the table. They can bring culture and values. Where are they right now? Where is the civilization of India and China in the Israel-Hamas war or in the Russia-Ukraine war? Where are the ideas? I see no new ideas coming out of anywhere, frankly. So this idea that we live in a multiplex world where not everybody is powerful and other countries are able to exert and influence power through culture, through ideas, through values, through norms, is not exactly visible. But there's something happening. There's a fragmentation happening. And the fragmentation is both international and subnational. So for example, if you look at the surveys of American public opinion when the war started around October 10, October 11, and if you look at the surveys now, you can see that American society is fracturing on this. And there's a polarization taking place. And the polarization is also taking place in the Democratic Party. And on the 2 wars also you can see the fracture, like President Biden requested $109 billion, 61 for Ukraine, 14.5 for Israel. And the Republican Congress basically said we are going to split the 2. And they passed the one for Israel, and they clearly are not going to pass the one for Ukraine. So you can see that the American elite, the American population, are fracturing at home. And then if you listen to Macron, and if you listen to Schulz of Germany, I was listening to Schulz talk about it, and I was stunned. It's like he has an off switch to his brain and an off switch to his conscience. And he put them both off while he was saying, and we see that Israel is committing no war crimes. And that is what we are going to say at every forum and all the time. I said, this is Olaf Scholz. He has no sense of morality, and that's how I understood that Germans were capable of the Holocaust. Because they are unable to make moral decisions when it matters. And then you hear Macron, he's on the opposite end of the spectrum, in Europe at least. So even Europe is fragmenting in their opinions on this particular war. So you see domestic level fragmentation in societies, you see fragmentation in the international level, and that is not good for the US, because the US believes in what is called force multiplier. And the force multiplier is these alliances and allies that it accumulates. So the US alliance with Europe is critical for its global hegemony in global order. So for example, if the US says, I'm going to war with China and I want my friends to come, there will be many friends who will join the US in that war. And it's trying to cultivate a new friend called India. And then when China says, I'm going to war with the US, I want my friends to come, who is going to come? Who will fight with China against the US? I can't think of anybody. But I can think of many countries who will join a US war with China. I can think of Australia. I can think of Japan. I can think of NATO. 31 countries, right? So suddenly the US has bigger force and bigger power than it is. But the fracturing of that makes it weaker. So the order which it is created and is trying to enforce through this is happening. So coming to these two wars, first of all, I'm personally very disappointed that the United States has failed to initiate a peace process in both the wars. There has been no steps taken by the US to bring about peace. Putin yesterday suddenly started talking as if he's a global statesman. War is a tragedy, blah, blah. So these so-called competing powers, they are also quite hypocritical. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi became so famous for saying this is not an era of war. But now when it comes to the Israeli-Hamas issue, he has not repeated it even once. He's not said it once that this is not an era of war. What happened to that sentiment? He's keeping quiet on that issue. So you see all these leaders making hypocritical decisions. But the US has not initiated any peace process with Russia because the US sees the war in Ukraine as basically scaring Europe. Russia scares Europe, so Europe gets aligned with the US. You run to daddy. We are selling billions of dollars worth of F-35s across Europe now because Russia has scared them. It's good for the US economy. You were buying cheap Russian gas and Russian oil. Now you're buying expensive American gas thanks to this whole response to the Ukrainian war. And the joke in some parts of the world is that America is going to fight Russia till the last Ukrainian. It's the Ukrainians who are getting destroyed, not America. And most of the money that we are giving as military aid, where do you think it is going? It's going to American companies. Today I learned that since the war started, Ukrainian holdings of US Treasury bonds has doubled. So first, the military money and weapons that we are giving to Ukraine is coming to all American companies. You're buying American javelins and whatever weapons, most of it from the US. All the money the Europeans are spending on weapons for Ukraine, most of it is also coming to the US. You know, I think it was Estonia or Latvia which raised $200 million to buy javelins from America and give it in the first early days of the war. So the money is coming to the US. But the aid that we're giving directly to Ukraine in humanitarian aid, they're taking that money and buying US Treasury bonds. And I don't understand I just read it this morning, and I'm going to investigate and figure like why is that money not being used for humanitarian crises, or what is that money for, and why are they buying US Treasury bonds? Is this some... I don't understand why that is happening. So that is one problem with the Ukrainian. And so the US has been selling it as promotion of democracy. Ukraine was never a democracy. Ukraine and Russia were in the same category as hybrid regimes with a lot of corruption in Ukraine. It was so corrupt that right now the Ukrainians had to fire all the Ministry of Defense people in order to get the next tranche of money from the US because of corruption during the war in Ukraine. But the US is promoting it as a struggle, a war between democracy and authoritarianism. Now all of that is collapsing with the Hamas Israel. All the US moral rhetoric in Ukraine is now being sort of overturned by this United States, in many ways unconditional and uncritical support of a war that increasingly looks as a very genocidal war. So I think these two wars are going to go a long way in undermining US hegemony and undermining the very order on which US hegemony was based. It could also impact American elections in 2024. Already, the latest polls show that Trump is leading Biden in all critical states and in national polls also. And in the latest polls, they have started asking the question. First, it was all about Biden's age, but now it's about Biden's role in this war. So the connection of the sudden dip in Biden's popularity is connected to the war. But Americans don't vote on foreign policy. They vote on domestic politics. So unfortunately, in spite of the fact that the US economy has done significantly well this quarter, 4.9%, unemployment is very low at 3.5%, 75% to 76% of Americans think and feel that the country is going in the opposite direction. So we might see some kind of change in 2024 elections. That doesn't mean that what's going to happen, I mean, we are unhappy with what the US currently is doing, but that doesn't mean that whoever is going to replace Biden is going to be better, especially if it's Donald Trump, who then you will once again have America first, and I don't know what that says to the world order. So I'm going to stop with that and be happy to take questions and comments, and as my phone says, it's 41 minutes, so I think I was on time. Thank you.
Maybe today I'm not the best person to be in the role of moderator because I'm emotionally overwhelmed. But you have been present to a lecture delivered by one of the world's biggest name in terms of international relations and one of the most eminent public intellectuals of his time and our time. It was very thought-provoking, and I'm sure that it will open a lot of space for discussion. So now I'm inviting all of you to ask questions so we can shape the global vision of today and tomorrow. Thank you, Professor Dr. Muqtedar.
Thank you.
It was really an honor.
Thank you. I think there's a question over there. Go ahead.
Yes.
Hello. Welcome, and thank you for...
Do you need the microphone?
I'm Dennis. I'm a law and political sciences student. I wanted to ask a question about the BRICS system and how do you think it will affect the hegemony economical-wise?
So the BRICS is the biggest non-Western global forum. Okay? And it's like SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But I think the expansion of BRICS might actually weaken BRICS, I think. Plus, there is a lot of internal disagreement. So India, Pakistan are part of BRICS. India, China are part of BRICS, and they are not really on the same page other than the fact that they are non-Western. So, but nevertheless, it is the popularity of BRICS among many countries. There are 40 countries who wanted to join BRICS, if you remember the last time they met in South Africa. And there are other emerging, shall we say, international forums where China is playing a more central role. So this is the Chinese emerging global order. To some extent, India is going to play a spoiler there. And that's why I think China plus 5 is another forum with Central Asia, if you're following that. It's the new BRICS and the new SCO without India and without Russia. So China is making those two efforts. But if India and Russia play ball, along with Brazil and Indonesia, then BRICS can become a very powerful alternate forum. If you look at the global top economies in the world, I was looking at, if you look at the GDP in the nominal sense, then the rankings are US, China, Japan, Germany, India, Britain, France. But if you change it to purchasing power parity, PPP, then suddenly you see in the top 8 are BRIC. So Brazil is the 8th, and Russia is the 6th, and India and China are already there. So half of the top 8 economies are BRIC economies in purchasing power. And these are growing with bigger populations, especially Brazil, India, and China. So BRICS is an alternative, but BRICS is not institutionalized for security relations, so security issues. And so the world is again going to be divided with an ineffective United Nations taking care of the security aspects of the world. And BRICS may encourage economic cooperation. There's a lot of talk going on at BRICS, but can you tell me something that they did economically? The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is also similar. The Chinese Bank for Alternative Development has given $35 billion in 10 years, whereas the World Bank gave $75 billion in 1 year. So the US established multilateral order is doing 10 times more than the Chinese. But the fact that it is emerging is something that shows that just as China is challenging the US hegemony globally, we are seeing alternative Eastern. The key is this. If you go back to 1900, I think, or even a little before that, you will find that Asia was just as powerful economically as it is now. And if you go further back, India and China dominated the global economy for centuries. They were 50% of the world. And we are going to see that again with India, China, Japan, Indonesia, South Korea. These are top economies. Add Taiwan to it. They are going to dominate the global economy way beyond into the future. The Western period of domination is a blip in world history. And gone there because of imperialism, colonization, and post-Renaissance developments in the West. So all of these things that you see with BRIC, etc., are the return of Asia, basically, to its proper role in world politics.
Do you want me to collect a few questions and to answer all of them?
I will try to keep my answers short.
Okay.
That's code word to give short. Yes, go ahead, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Khan, for your presentation. I would like to offer a counter-argument to the claim you made that the non-intervention of Russia or China or any other so-called power in what's happening in Israel and Gaza right now is a proof that there is still U.S. hegemony, that we do not live in a multipolar world. And while no one would argue that there was U.S. hegemony the last 30 years or so, I would counter-argue that non-intervention doesn't necessarily imply non-existence of these powers in the world stage. I would argue that it is simply not in their interest to get involved in this particular conflict. In the case of China, it has pursued what is called a peaceful rise, meaning they have other tools of expanding their power, not getting involved in conflicts, whereas Russia has bigger fish to fry, so to speak. They have their own conflict to think about. So while Israel has been of strategic interest for the US since its beginnings, it hasn't been so for Russia or China, so they allow it to be the US's playing ground. Not getting involved does not mean that they are necessarily less relevant players in the international arena. And a question for you. You've mentioned several times that certain leaders, political leaders in the US are maybe advocating for a US first policy. This isolationism by the US has been a former foreign policy of the US until the World War I. But how can they win? How can any leader, doesn't matter if they're Democrats or Republicans, win this argument when on one side the US is heavily criticized for playing the role of policeman of the world and getting involved in interventions uninvited all over the globe, while on the other side, if they propose to become less interventionist and focus internally, they're criticized for not caring for conflicts around the world, for security around the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I will take the first one first. So the idea of the multipolar world says that the world is composed of many global powers and also several regional powers. So that also includes talking about India, China, and Russia and Japan as world powers, but also Turkey and Saudi Arabia as regional powers. I really don't see them doing anything, even in the regional level. So if you look at the war in Ukraine as a reaction to US expansion of NATO, the current war is a reaction to US expansion of the Abrahamic Accords. even Biden said it, that I see Hamas's attack on October 7th. Yes, it's a terrorist attack, very brutal, etc., but he said that he saw that as Hamas's reaction to the expansion of Abrahamic Accords. He called it integration of Israel into the Middle East. So if that is the case, I don't think that solidifying US control of the Middle East, that's what Abrahamic Accords would have done, is not in the interest of Russia, China, or India. If you want to be a global power, you cannot say, I'm not interested in this region, I'm not interested in that region, or this region. Then you're not a global power. If you say, I'm interested only in region A, then you are a regional power, congratulations. But if you are a global power, then you cannot say, I'm not interested in what happens in the Middle East, I'm not interested in what happens in China. That is one thing. About the other part is, I disagree that America first is going to be an isolationist policy. It will be a selective engagement. So if tomorrow there's a genocide in Balochistan, or a genocide in Rwanda, or a genocide in Myanmar, well, actually, two of those have already happened, right? Nobody cares. So there you can see a US first policy already, because by law the US is required to intercede wherever there is genocide. The US is required to, so we don't classify them as genocide, so we don't have to go in there. So the US, even in the era when it was a global power, has selective engagement. You will see a much more intensity of selective engagement by America first. So it depends on who makes the argument that this particular international interest directly affects US employment, US economy, US security, so America first will apply. There's a perception in America that the US is giving a lot of money and aid away, which is actually not true. So this is a reaction to that, and a general unhappiness because America is getting divided into a rich America and a poor America, and I think it's the poor Americans who are attracted to this idea of America first. They hope to benefit more from that. Yes, go ahead.
I want to ask. I want to ask that, like you mentioned, United States is hurting and harming its own institutions that is created to protect its own gains.
Mm-hmm.
And we can all see this.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody can see this. I really want to understand your opinion on what is the reason behind that, because when people from outside of the United States looks at, we see it stupid. Because why the United States is doing this? Like SWIFT you mentioned, or the criminal codes, international criminal codes, that is trying to create it to protect the United States' own gains. Now they're hurting them. So for future. And what is the reason behind this? Is this public opinion, or lobbying, or money, or stupid diplomats? What is the reason behind this?
So there is always this tension between values and interests. So sometimes America promotes values because it's an American values, but sometimes when those values begin to hurt American interests directly, America often chooses its interests over the very values it promotes. That's number one. So it's like democracy promotion, right? Right now the US is putting a lot of pressure on Bangladesh to have fair and free elections, but not putting any pressure on Pakistan to do the same, because the US wants a particular kind of government to emerge actually in both states. So one place, democracy promotion is being used to try and get the kind of government they want in Bangladesh. And in other places, there is no pressure for democracy promotion because the US wants. So you can clearly see that the US is allowing its interest in both the countries to override its broader interest of promoting democracy. But even going beyond that, there are articles now in the US newspapers which are attacking Harvard and Columbia and all of these universities because they are pro-Palestine. So the US might destroy its own Ivy Leagues to protect Israel. And that's not America first, that's Israel first. So it is ridiculous. Billionaires are saying, give me the list of all the Harvard students who are protesting and writing letters so that we will make sure they don't get jobs on the Wall Street. So if you're not going to get the best and the brightest on Wall Street, you are also hurting the Wall Street. So these are short-term, stupid ideas. America is very smart. There are a lot of smart Americans, but we also have a lot of stupid Americans, and often they are in government. So I'm sorry to say that we tend to do this. Because America is so economically powerful, etc., many of the mistakes that America makes, it has a slack that it is able to survive as a result of it, which other countries would not be able to survive if they made the same mistakes. But that freedom to make stupid mistakes is reducing. America's capacity to survive its own stupid mistakes is reducing, and that is one of the reasons why we are worried about what is going to happen after America. America is becoming an illiberal democracy. So what happens to democracy promotion and multilateralism worldwide if we become an illiberal democracy?
Hello, Professor. Very nice presentation. Thank you. I want to ask something about USA foreign policy related to Israel. How come that USA, no matter the president, no matter the candidates from Republic, the Democrats, always they support Israel, no matter what?
Joe Biden used to go around saying that my support for Israel is ironclad, right?
Unconditional.
No, he likes to use the word ironclad support. Now we know what that means. It means that if Israel even indulges in a genocidal war, we will continue to support it. It's a very, very big topic as to why. Part of it is about the Judeo-Christian issues. It's not just, in fact, the biggest critics of the US today are young Jewish community. America is divided in age. Most people below the age of 35 are opposed to this war. Most of the people above 65 are with Israel. So America's past is what you are seeing in action today, but not America's future. America's future is in the marches in Harvard and Columbia and on the streets in Washington and all the protests that you are seeing in American society. So it's not all Americans. But as far as the congressional support is the power of the pro-Jewish lobby, which includes Christian Zionists and others. So for example, if you are on Twitter or Instagram, you will see a post going around saying AIPAC is going to spend $100 million in the coming elections to defeat the Quad, AOC, Ilhan Omar, and those who have been critical of Israel. So a lobby is going to spend $100 million to defeat you because you were critical of Israel in the Congress. That scares the hell out of politicians who are career politicians. See, one of the problems of democracy are that people have become career politicians. So this is their job. And their job is being threatened, so they will play ball. So there is that pressure. But there are also the difficulties of working with the rest of the Arab world and the absence of democracy in the Arab world. So for example, the only difference that people defend is Israel says, oh, we are not trying to kill everybody. In Palestinians, they killed 1,200 people and say, the Hamas kills 1,200 people and says, we want to kill them all. And Israel kills 13,000 and says, no, we are not trying to kill them all. And that becomes an argument to say, oh, they have no intention of genocide, and these people are. What if Hamas said, we don't want to kill them all, we just want freedom? So basically, they're being very stupid and not understanding how it will resonate in the Western media. They're only interested in how it will resonate in their supportive media, right? So that further says, oh my God, these guys are genocidal terrorists. And they did commit some terrorist acts. They are not attuned to the battle for American public opinion. They don't care about it, whereas Israel cares a lot about the American public opinion, and supporters of Israel try to shape a lot of that. But part of it is religious. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that this is jihad for Israel. They are defending it, and I don't know, you should see, there are things called the Jerusalem Embassy or something like that, billions of dollars of aid go to Israel. There's a lot of support in the Congress, etc. So there's a religious component, there's a political component, and people like to keep saying that, oh, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. But Israel also might be the only apartheid state in the world at the same time, right? But the other part is not resonating that much in American media. The US on this issue is completely separate from the rest of the world. But the more interesting thing is Europe, actually. So the Europe thinks like the Middle East, but acts like US. To me, that is the most puzzling thing, if you listen to most, except Germany, of course. But most of the Europeans are protesting, a number of protests, millions of people marching in London and other parts of the world. But their governments, it's to me very confusing. It shows that this is not democratic. The US policy, European policies towards Israel are not democratic, but they are going to become more democratic, and you can see that. So I'll give you two examples of under pressure. So Biden came up and said, we stand with Israel, no matter what, etc. Like we stood with Ukraine, right? Whatever it takes, till as long as it takes. That was the slogan for Ukraine. But then suddenly, Muslims in the US said, we are not going to vote for Biden in 2024 if he doesn't call for a ceasefire. And so in Michigan, it's very critical. The Arab and Muslim vote can defeat Biden in Michigan. So suddenly he comes out and says, let's have humanitarian pauses. And then guess what? The next day he sends Kamala Harris to say, we're going to launch a national strategy against Islamophobia right in the middle of this war. Really? How stupid do they think we are? And on top of that, sending Kamala Harris to say that tells us he's not serious about it. All the non-serious work is given to Kamala Harris. Have you noticed in any of the major crises, she's not playing any significant role. But he tried to throw a kind of a lollipop at American Muslims and say, oh, we will have a Islamophobia strategy, hoping to keep the vote. But he's feeling the pressure to say that. That itself tells you that America is changing, because he suddenly realized that he could have a huge problem in November in 2024 if we are able to sustain the Muslim and Arab anger in the United States. But that's not enough. The young people, progressive Democrats, it's not just Muslims, most of the young Jews, they're all against this policy. So things are changing in America, so that's why the age divide.
I believe there are even more interesting questions, but time is always a challenge. So it was a really rare moment, if I can say. Usually we start with, thank you. Usually we start with full amphitheater and end with empty amphitheater, but this time we started with almost full amphitheater and ended up with full amphitheater. So I'm really, really, really grateful to Dr. Khan for his visit. And if I'm able to deliver on our promise in my life, it will be because of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. But also, once again, I'm very thankful to the university, to the rectorate, to the general secretariat, to the faculty, to all of our colleagues, and especially to our students who are now jumping from one exam to another exam, and they're actually having exam at 3:30. Yes, I know, but still managed to be present here.
I think we need an applause for that.
Yes. I'm really grateful that you did. I forgot to say one thing. I have a YouTube channel called Conversations. So KHANV Conversations. So it is half in English and half in Indian language. So if you see the thumbnail has some foreign language, don't click it. But if the thumbnail is only in English, then watch it, because I'm going to be talking a lot about most of these issues frequently. So please subscribe to the channel and watch it. Thank you.
Yes. I was just about to mention Conversations. Yes, if you want to hear relevant opinions about all the hot topics in world politics, please follow Conversations on daily and weekly basis. And the biggest motivation we have in our endeavors in our academic life is actually to create more opportunities for you, the students. You are not only the future, you are actually the present. So now I would also like to invite Vice Rector Professor Dr. Mevludin Ibish to greet Dr. Khan in the name of the university. Thank you so
You have
much.
enlightened us. Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And from our students from Art and Design, we always give presents to our noble guests.
Oh,
So
wow. Thank you
this is
very
for you
much.
from our students. Thank you very much. I hope you will pack it for the airport, but if not, we will find a way through DHL
ship it to me?
ship it, yeah.
Yes.
If that is a problem for you, but in case, very much delighted to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are we done?
Okay, so with this we end this very special event, and I'm sure that this will open even more opportunities, as I said, for you, the students, and will strengthen our cooperation with the U.S. universities, especially with the University of Delaware.
Thank you.
Thank you so much once again.